most of you coming here since we've had that little wind incident back in September. The good news is center made it through pretty good. A few leaks here, a few leaks there, but we've had a few leaks here, a few leaks there. So we actually turned out fairly good. Well, the first thing I want to do is recognize our Bluefish Society members. Their support contribution helps make this possible. We really appreciate all the help and support they give. Just a few other things. A lot's been happening. I just want to run down a few kind of cool milestones. Many of you are familiar with John Morrison's CubeSat. It was successfully launched in November, and it's actually sending back data. So over the coming months, we hope to get much more ocean imagery in UNCW's first satellite. So that's kind of cool. Some of you may have heard that the university in December was recognized as a Research to University by Carnegie Foundation. Basically, it's a recognition of the growing research we have, as well as some of our graduate programs. So I think that was a cool recognition of all the stuff that's happening. And in terms of growth, we've had 4 new faculty. I see a few of them, I won't embarrass them, but I saw a couple of them come in. 4 new faculty entered this spring, and these are new lines, new expertise to help in terms of marine sciences, in addition to the 3 new faculty we had in the fall. So we're really growing expertise in a variety of areas. And some of you may have heard we're actually going to be starting a coastal engineering baccalaureate in this coming fall as well. So a lot's happening in marine sciences, keeping everything busy and growing in a lot of different areas. Well, with that, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Director Steve Murphey, from the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. Director Murphy has been Director of the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries since January 2018. Prior to that, he was Chief of the Division's Habitat Enhancement section, where he oversaw several programs, including Coach Planning, Critical Habitat Protection Plan, Artificial Reef Program, Oyster Sanctuary Program, Shellfish Lease Program, and the Shellfish Mapping Program. And in his spare time, I think was then asked to do everything else. He also served as the Artificial Reef Coordinator for what was then called the Research Enhancement section, as well as working with the Shellfish Sanitation section, where he oversaw shoreline surveys for pollution sources to shellfish growing areas. Director Murphy is a native Floridian, grew up in Florida. However, most importantly, he holds his baccalaureate degree in marine biology from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Okay. So with that, I'll introduce Director Murphy, who will talk on North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, Adapting to Change.
Thank you guys very much. Thank you, Mark. So I graduated from here. This actually was just woods when I was here. In 1987. Can you hear? I'm sorry. I might need a microphone.
Yeah, looking for you.
That's apparently not the microphone. I'll stand by until I have more assistance. Okay. Oh, that's fancy. Better? Yes. Ah, okay, very good. Thank you. So like Mark said, I graduated here in 1984, and have done a lot of things in the marine resources and marine fisheries field. So I started as a technician, and I think that's important. I talked with some students today. I don't have an advanced degree. I have a Bachelor of Science degree, but in 1984 you could get a job with a Bachelor of Science degree. I was hungry. I had not eaten 3 meals a day for several years, and so I decided getting a job was more important than going to graduate school. Plus, I was one of those students who had to make the dean's list to get off the dean's list. So I thought it would be sort of pushing fate if I tried to do that anyway. I've done a little bit of everything in my career in South Carolina and also here. And so when the opportunity that came up in 2017 to lead the Division of Marine Fisheries, I said, hey, I might as well try it. You know, I have a great deal of respect for the people who work there, and to be perfectly honest, I was a little tired of us getting beat up, and a lot of misinformation that went out, so I took on that role. So I've had to learn more in the past year than I probably learned in the whole time I was there. And so staff have been great at mentoring me, and we do have some tremendous staff, some very smart staff. But I've had to learn a lot, and so my learning curve has been steep. But I want to share with you tonight some issues that over the past year that I've seen that have impacted the division. So I want to have sort of a high level, yet not too serious talk about adapting to change. And it's not just climate change, it's I might have to hold this. It's not just climate change, it's just all types of change, really. And climate certainly is a serious issue that we're dealing with. So with that, I'll do the perfunctory administrative slides first. Let me pull this off here. There we go. All right, I'm going to carry this around, and that way maybe I won't rub on it. So the perfunctory administrative slide. So the Division Marine Fisheries is basically organized into sections. 6 of those sections are programmatic. We have about 340 to 350 full and part-time staff. And they work anywhere from our main office in Moorhead, an annex in Moorhead, Elizabeth City, Manio, Wilmington, Little Washington, and we even have a guy who works out of his house in Reedsville, North Carolina, which is about 40 minutes north of Winston-Salem. And he went to school here too. A good friend of mine, Jeff French, and he is actually the shellfish inspector for the entire western part of the state of North Carolina. We do cover the entire state of North Carolina. So if you are selling fish in Durham or Asheville, and that fish is illegal, then we have jurisdiction over that fish. And so we do make forays into the western part of the state, and we do write citations and make cases on that. We give presentations to people in that part of the state as well. So we are a state fisheries agency, even though our resources are confined to the coast in the marine and estuarine areas. So the sections that you see here in the blue are going to be the sections that I want to sort of focus on here in the first part, because that's really where a lot of the challenges are coming from. So we have a councils and commissions, a fisheries management section, license and statistics, the habitat enhancement section where I grew up and came from, marine patrol, and shellfish sanitation and recreational water quality, which I also spent about 12 years in. So our budget is not large when you look at the size of our division. This is a 2018 budget, but we're less than $30 million. A lot of people think that we're state funded. We get about 60% of our funding from the state. The rest of it comes from grants, license sales, things like that. So when we have government shutdown, we're impacted. When people aren't buying as many licenses as they used to, we're impacted. And so we're really scrambling, like most state agencies, to keep the services that we need to provide, and a lot of those are very complicated and expensive, while looking at a reduced budget. In the past 8 years, our state appropriations have been reduced 42%. And that's pretty much common across the board if you look at most state agencies. And a lot of that was due to the economic downturn, but it is a struggle to try to keep funding. So enough of that. Now, I use the proprietary PowerPoint slide show. So, and then on this computer, it tends to corrupt some of the graphics. So this looks like I designed it, and it looks kind of cool, but I got a couple slides here a little later that's not going to look that good. So, so our fisheries management section is one of the largest sections that we have. And it is, again, it's a coast-wide section. They're responsible for developing our fishery management plans, both for the state Marine Fisheries Commission, and I'll get into that in a little bit, as well as working with our councils and commissions to develop those regional plans with them as well. They do an awful lot of independent sampling, or what we call fishery independent sampling. So we get data really from, when we're talking about fisheries, we get data really from two sources. We get fishery dependent data, where we rely on the information coming from the fishermen, harvest, landings. We get that through our trip tickets, those types of things. And then we have independent data, where we actually go out and collect it. So we have a pretty robust program or a section that has, I don't know, dozens of programs that look at juvenile fish assemblages, shrimp sampling, Pamlico Sound sampling, gill net sampling, large mesh, small mesh. You name it, we probably have a program that looks at it. And this is really what the fishery management section does. This one picture is striped bass tagging for Atlantic striped bass. This is in cooperation with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and we do this about this time of year off of North Carolina's Outer Banks, and so it's cold. We also do a lot of fish aging. When you look at fisheries management, it's important to know how old the fish is. So we have an aging lab that it either looks at scales and the annuli on the scales, or they look at otoliths, which are the ear bones that they can take out, and they can section them and then look at those, and they have to be prepared a certain type of way. We have tournaments where we not only get data, but we have outreach, and we're allowed to go out and work with some of these tournaments. And of course, we do stock assessments where we try to determine a certain stock, such as red drum. We try to determine the health of that fishery and how big it is. What's the biomass of that fishery? How many are out there? Because if we don't know that, then we have a hard time calculating how to manage that fishery. So that's kind of the first thing we do in a fishery management plan. And then, of course, we do observer coverage on gillnet trips in North Carolina, but we also do observer coverage on other fisheries. This gives us information that's very important, because landings data, when you get harvest data, it really only tells you what they're bringing back to the dock. We want to know what they threw back, right? Because what they throw back, a certain percentage of that dies. And so that's a removal from the fishery, and that's important for us to know when we're calculating some of our management recommendations in a stock assessment. So license and statistics, they are really the number crunchers of the agency. This is where a lot of our statisticians are. They do licensing and our trip ticket program, which is the commercial landings. But they also are the people that are going to meet you on a pier or a dock, and they're going to interview you, and they're going to ask you what type of fish you caught. They may ask to measure your fish, or maybe to take an otolith or something. We have assistance programs. Right now, the division is mandated by the North Carolina General Assembly to have an assistance program from Hurricane Florence and the impacts it had on commercial fishermen. And so that charge was given to us, and this program is where that's handled. We do a lot of quota monitoring. A lot of the fisheries that we look at have a certain quota or a number of fish that can be taken out of that fishery, and after that it's closed. And so in order to do that, we have to call dealers and find out how many fish they landed in a certain week or whatever, and then we monitor that quota. Do a lot of stuff in that. The habitat enhancement section, this is where I come from. Martin went over some of the things we do. This is a building section. We build a lot of things here. We have a lot of heavy equipment, a lot of cranes and larger vessels, and we do programs that are probably more visible to the public, sort of like the artificial reef program or oyster sanctuary, aquaculture. which I'm gonna talk about a little bit as one of the challenges we have. So the oyster lease program, that's aquaculture, that falls under this section. You might have a dock, you want to raise some oysters, we do an under dock oyster program for those types of people. And of course, we also do the coastal habitat protection plan, which when you get down to it, a lot of times it's not a commercial versus recreational issue, it's a habitat issue. And it's very difficult to keep people focused on that. And so Ann Deaton, another UNCW graduate, does our habitat protection program, and she's in charge of that. Our Marine Patrol is our enforcement arm, and it's the way we, make sure that you're following the rules. There's about 3.5 million acres of water in North Carolina. We have 56 officers to enforce it with, and 3 of them sit in the office all the time, don't do anything. So, you call a colonel up, dumb, I told him that too. We just hired a new Marine Patrol colonel. So, this is a huge challenge for us to get out on the water. And if you're out on the water and you see one of these guys, they're there to help you. They may want to check your cooler, they may want to see what you have to catch, but overall, the public servants, just like everybody else, wear a badge and a gun. So we do have some assets that they have. They have a lot of boats. They have 2 fixed-wing aircraft, which is odd since we only have 1 pilot. We used to have a helicopter, which was very handy until the legislature passed a law that you couldn't have a helicopter. And so we had to sell that on eBay. Maybe one of y'all bought it. We do a lot of education with Marine Patrol. We do a lot of outreach. We go to state fair. We go to fishing shows. We go to those kind of things and talk to people about our rules and ethical angling practices and things like that. We do inspections with other agencies, including the Coast Guard, National Marine Fisheries, and we also assist in search and rescue. And we were very proud of our Marine Patrol this year because we did over 65 swiftwater rescues of people during Hurricane Florence from Bolivia all the way up into Carteret County. So where our officers were actually either on foot wading in or in boats, because a lot of places we had to put boats in, rescuing people from their homes where the water was rising up too high. I live in Newport, which is a little town just outside of Morehead City. I was trapped by floodwaters, and they were doing swiftwater rescues in front of my house, and they never checked on me. And so I don't know what that says about loyalty, but I let them slide on that. So this is another corrupted issue, but it gets better. So our Shellfish Sanitation section, I spent a lot of time there. How many people like oysters? These are the people that keep you from going to the hospital. Okay? So Marine Fisheries has a public health aspect to it. This section actually used to be in the Division of Environmental Health. And for some reason, in 2011, the General Assembly decided they were going to do away with that, and so they dissolved that division and sent all the health inspection people to one place, to the Division of Health and Human Services. They sent Shellfish Sanitation to Marine Fisheries. It makes sense because we work a lot with Marine Fisheries. The Marine Patrol is the main enforcement arm for controlling shellfish harvest in North Carolina, so that made sense. So they look at, first of all, they classify the growing areas so that the waters where people are allowed to harvest shellfish are well sampled and classified. They do the openings and closings that you'll see after rainfall events or during a hurricane. But they also certify dealers. So people that are processing crabs, processing cooked shrimp, shucking oysters, those are all certified dealers, and they're inspected regardless of where they are in the state. Getting back to my buddy who lives in Reedsville, right? So that's what he does. He works with the Cisco's, the U.S. Foods, and even the smaller dealers in those areas who are processing shellfish. And then we do recreational water quality, and that was added to our task in the early 2000s with the advent of the Beach Act, which is an EPA act for beach water quality. And so we sample all your beaches. And if the bacterial levels are too high, we post swimming advisories on those. So you hopefully have not seen those, but those do occur from time to time, particularly in some areas where we have a lot of development and stormwater runoff. We do operate, used to have 3, soon will be 3 again, FDA certified labs, one in Nags Head, one in Moorhead, and one down here in Wilmington. And we run about 10,000 bacterial samples a year, plus meat samples. So we manage fish in North Carolina a variety of ways, right? So we manage state species. There are 13 state species or groups that we manage through our State Marine Fisheries Commission. We manage interstate fisheries that occur in state waters up and down the coast of the United States from Florida to Maine through the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. We manage offshore fisheries that occur from Cape Hatteras to Florida through the South Atlantic Council. And then we manage offshore species that occur from Cape Hatteras to Maine, or actually up to about New York, through the Mid-Atlantic Council. And so, so there's a lot of travel involved in a lot of the councils that, in council and commission management we do. A lot of people just think that, you know, we come up with a rule and we throw it out there and see what works, right? But there's a lot of work that goes into these commissions, which actually have the ability to, or the responsibility to adopt the fishery management plans. So if you like to fish for black sea bass and you don't like the size limit, then the size limit was set by the South Atlantic Council. And we participate on that and we have input into that process, but it's a council managed species. So that, I just want to kind of paint that a little bit. So tonight I want to talk about change, right? And so there's a lot of different changes that we have had to deal with over the years, and it has created some interesting challenges for us. It's created, different ways that we have to approach management of fish, management of public health, sampling regimes, even the way we interact with our stakeholders. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but it's some that I want to talk about. Primarily, our mission is to ensure sustainable marine and estuarine fisheries and habitats for the benefit and health of the people of North Carolina. That sounds very lofty, right? But that's a mission, and we have to have one because I work for the government, and we're all about writing mission statements. So we have a goal too, but it takes up 3 slides, so I'm not going to. So the challenge for us is how do we follow this mission while adapting to all the change that we see. So population, species distribution, right? So where the species are located now versus where they used to be. Technology. Technology has certainly changed since I started here. Fishing practices, right? How do we reduce mortality, right? That's the key with fishing. When you add more people, the fish will only carry a certain capacity. So how do you keep that mortality down to an acceptable level? And what are the acceptable means of doing that, and what are the pitfalls there? Temperature. The temperature is going up. Well, not a couple weeks ago it wasn't, but it is nice to think. And regardless of what causes it, we're dealing with those temperature shifts. Sea level rise. We are dealing with sea level rise. And just minute changes in sea level rise, if you think about it, if I have another inch of the ocean coming in my inlet, which is 1.5 miles wide, twice a day, I'm putting a lot more salt water in my systems, right? So I'm changing salinity regimes in rivers that have never seen that before. What's the impact of that? And what's the challenge there? Even challenges to our science, right? And so some of that is technology. These are all interwoven. There's a lot of connections to that, but I want to discuss some. Even this changed, right? When I went to school at UNC Wilmington, I took a methods class. Has anybody taken a methods class? Right? Right? You know what my methods class was? How to put, well, not the whole thing, but one day we had a class on how to put the slide in the carousel the right way so that when you showed it, it wouldn't turn upside down or be backwards. That was a challenge, right? Because nothing looks more boneheaded than to show up for a presentation and have your slide be upside down, right? Overhead projectors. We love those. Don't see those very often. Film projectors, right? So all of this is out the window. I can just plug all this stuff into a PowerPoint and then it corrupts onto someone else's computer. So the first thing I want to talk about is change in population. So the map here is from UNC, from their population center. And you can see the projected growth through the next decade, which is tomorrow or next year, right? Shows where the big population centers are. And you guys are down here, you know that's happening. Brunswick County, New Hanover, Fender County. But all of these counties are seeing a lot of growth. There are certainly more people here now than when I was going to school here. And then that has impacts. By the same token, there are some counties in North Carolina that are losing population. And some of those counties are counties that are important in our commercial fishing industry. Hyde County, Tyrrell County, some of the counties up along the Pamlico Sound up in there, even parts of Pamlico County. So these present challenges to us, right? So we see reductions or gains in job opportunities, right? Why am I talking about jobs? I'm a fishery guy, right? Well, because when I go to the General Assembly, it's all about jobs, right? The money they give me is jobs. It's about jobs. It's how many jobs can you create for my district? How many jobs can you create for this district? If I do aquaculture here, is it going to create more jobs? And so we do see that. We do see that there is an increase or a decrease in jobs. We see a big increase in conflict, right? Increase in boats. Of course, everybody's got a boat now. Everybody's boat's got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 engines on it. I can't wait for the day for gas to go back to $5. So it's going to be fun. But we do see a lot more conflict. I was talking to 2 of my colleagues over here, old DMF employees that are much older than I am, and really the conflict is pretty much as bad as I've seen it. And a lot of the conflict is commercial versus recreation. A lot of it is use, what we use the water for. Maybe it's view shed, maybe it's the don't touch that button, that's what he told me. So maybe it's like someone doesn't want to look at a shellfish lease or floating bags in front of their house. That's certainly something that I would consider if I just paid $1 million for a piece of waterfront property, right? A lot of it's about allocation. Fisheries management is basically this, right? So if you're looking at fisheries management, here's the equation. The number of fish coming into a population that's recruiting into the population has to equal or be greater than the number of fish going out. That's it, right? Now, if Dr. Sharp is here, he's like, well, that's pretty simple. But that's pretty much the bottom line equation, right? So it's how you allocate the fish that you have available for harvest that's what becomes the real controversy, right? It's who gets what. It's do the recreational people get this many and the commercial people get this many? Does New York get more than North Carolina? That's allocation. And allocation to me is one of the most divisive things we deal with. So changes in stock distribution, right? We have seen significant shifts in the past 10 years of our fisheries. And so some of these shifts are just expansions. We still have the fish here, but now it's moved northern in its range, and so now it's another couple states have this fishery. And again, we go back to allocation. But the general movement that we see due to climate change, and there have been several studies on this, is that fish are tending to move poleward, right? So they're moving towards the poles and deeper. And so, and it's because of water temperature. And the water temperature increases. And very small changes in that water temperature are impacting these fisheries. And it is causing huge concern in the fisheries management community of how to deal with this. We are now under a lawsuit on the Mid-Atlantic Council from the state of New York because of summer flounder. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But so the impacts to that are, of these distribution shifts, are fishing practices, right? So maybe I have to change the way I fish now. Fair allocation, we'll talk about that a lot. Infrastructure, you know? Why does it matter if you take allocation away from North Carolina, if I'm a commercial fisherman, and give it to someone, you know, up north? Well, because I spent $10 million building this processing facility here, and I can't pick it up and move it. I've got infrastructure that's tied to it. I have businesses that are associated with that, shipyards, supply stores, those kind of things. And we didn't plan when we built that of the fish moving, right? And that's what they're doing. Management, certainly a challenge to management, lawsuits, and even habitat. And like I said, the elephant in the room is often habitat, right? So as the temperatures rise, some of our more important seagrasses die earlier in the summer. That's habitat. That is strategic habitat for a lot of juvenile fishes. They live in the SAB, that submerged aquatic vegetation. And that increased temperature is causing them to die earlier. It may cause an expansion of other grasses northern, you know, more north in their range. So there may be some benefits to that as well. But we do see some of the changes that we have. Some examples I'll give you along the Atlantic coast are black sea bass. So there are two stocks of black sea bass. And Dr. Linda Mercer went to UNC Wilmington. And then became the director of the Maine Division of Marine Fisheries. Did a lot of work on this, and they determined there are two genetically different stocks of black sea bass, one south of Cape Hatteras and one north of Cape Hatteras. So you look at black sea bass right here, the center of distribution for the northern stock used to be off of Virginia. And now, really, this is 2015, now we're estimating that 80% of the biomass, the weight of that mature fishery, 80% of the biomass of the black sea bass stock north of Hatteras is north of Hudson Canyon, right? So Hudson Canyon is that big deep water thing that comes right off of New York right here. So that's pretty striking, right? So it's moved where these fish are going. Summer flounder. Allocations and distribution, or allocations of fisheries to, say, our commercial fishing fleet, are based on historic land use. So North Carolina has the largest allocation of summer flounder on the East Coast. We get about 26% of the entire East Coast allocation of summer flounder, commercial summer flounder. Those fish are being caught, does anybody know? You know, they'll talk to you. Sorry for killing someone with a laser. Backwards. Those fish are being caught off Montauk. Okay? New York gets 7% of the allocation of summer flounder. You see why they're suing us now? So, well, like I said, there's a lot of other factors that go into there. So these guys from North Carolina are running up to New York, they're trawling 12 hours, they're putting their allocation on the boat, and then they come down and they land in the various ports that they have allocation for in New Jersey, and Delaware, and Virginia, and North Carolina. And that's how the summer flounder fishery works. It's our 5th most valuable commercial fishery, summer flounder. And the chances are when you go to a restaurant, this time of year, you're eating summer flounder, not southern flounder. Atlantic Ocean striped bass are also seeing a significant shift. They're now being found in Canada, in the St. Lawrence River, where no one's ever seen them before. Black sea bass are now up into the Gulf of Maine, and where they're spending summers now in the Gulf of Maine. So huge potential impact to North Carolina fishermen, just, loss of income. If you're a charter fisherman and you were taking people out on 6-pack trips to catch black sea bass out of Oregon Inlet, you're not going to have as many fish. They're moving. And typically what happens with fisheries is, particularly with some of these species, is the farther north they go, the larger they are. And so the biomass, most of those fish are up north. Some of this is exacerbated from the fisherman's standpoint because of regulations that make it harder to catch these fish that are down here. Like south of Cape Henry, you have to have a turtle excluder device and a trawl, and that's not conducive to trawling for flounder. They'll shoot right through it. So part of it's that, but most of it is just a shift in distribution. So this is just some recent scientific literature from Dr. Morley, who's now working at IMS up in Morehead City. And he basically just did a huge literature search and looked at all of this data and found that there were shifts in over 680 species that he would project into the 21st century. And with a 2-degree temperature increase, you would be looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 100-kilometer shift in the Atlantic, 230 kilometers on the Pacific side, because you have different currents running there. And a 4-degree C shift, you'd be looking at 600-kilometer shift in fisheries. That takes a fish straight out of North Carolina and puts it somewhere off the coast of Delaware, right? And so, in addition to this, you'd have a lot of issues with the habitat, growth, reproduction. Temperature has a lot to do with how fish reproduce and grow. So, serious concerns with this. Technology. I grew up fishing in the 1970s and 80s. If you had high technology, I mean, if you were really the bee's knees and had some money to spend, you had a flasher and a compass. By the late 1980s, by 1985, 86 on in, we had this piece of equipment here called a Loran C. This was developed by the military to keep ships from running into each other, right? So Loran C was a system that used 3 towers, a master and 2 slave stations, and they would all ping at the same time. And so that ping from all 3 of those stations would come across as time differences, or TDs, in microseconds on these 2 lines. And if you had enough notes written on a card, you could go back and get, within a couple hundred feet of a reef or a wreck or something like that, a fishing spot. That was cutting edge technology. Today, for less than that cost, I can buy one of these with a GPS, a plotter. It's got a map. I can hook it up to my VHS. It's got, it shows me tracks of where other people have been. I can plug a number in. It's no bigger than that chair, and it'll take me to it. And all I got to do is steer. And if you got a little more money, your boat will steer, right? So it's easier to find the fish than it was back in the days when Rudyard Kipling wrote Captains Courageous, and they went out to fish for cod in little boats, and most of them never came back again. And we're much more efficient at it. This is a super trawler off of Australia. Those are people, right? And so these things have the capability of being very efficient in the way they catch fish. T.H. Huxley, back in 1883, gave a presentation to a science commission of the day. He said, "I believe that it may be affirmed with confidence that in relationship to our present modes of fishing, a number of the most important sea fisheries, such as the cod fishery, the herring fishery, and the mackerel fishery, are inexhaustible." They just did not see how we could catch all the fish that were out there. Well, we did. And it was largely through technology shifts and technology changes. The herring fishery is depleted. The cod fishery collapsed. It is now rebuilding. The mackerel fishery, depends on what mackerel you are, isn't doing too awfully bad. But 2 out of 3 is not good when you're in this business. So we've looked at ways to reduce fishing mortality, but we've created panaceas where panaceas don't exist. And we've, through television or through outdoor channels, we've created some myths that we need to address, because nothing in this business is absolute. So one is catch and release fishing, right? So you got the 2 cats up there, the world's gone mad, what is this? When I was growing up, you caught fish, you put them in a cooler and you ate them, right? There is a growing element of people who just catch fish to release them, right? Well, that's a blood sport, right? You're poking holes in a fish with a hook or a series of hooks. It's not without any impact. And we know there is discard mortality, but in some fisheries, there's significant mortality. Certainly going out and just hammering everything like that, although those are some impressive bluefish, I tell you that. That's Hatteras back in the day. That was back when Rich was around, but everything was in black and white then. This has become less than sort of letting it go. But I wanted to share with you a graph, and this is from a draft. We don't print this anywhere. This is from a draft stock assessment that I watched last week on Atlantic striped bass, right? So, and don't try to read all this. This is time. These are years from 1982 to 2017. These are millions of fish, right? The blue is commercial harvest. The little hash mark is commercial discard mortality. We've gotten our commercial gear to the point where in some fisheries, such as the striped bass fishery, is pretty efficient, but we can reduce discard mortality by changing the shape of the gear or how it's prosecuted, how that gear is prosecuted. We do have serious discard mortality in many of the commercial fisheries we have, so, and we're working to address that. But in the striped bass fishery, the commercial segment is primarily Virginia. We don't really see a whole lot more striped bass off our coast as they move. So the gray is recreational harvest, right? So that's what they brought back. That's what they put in the boat. The yellow is discard mortality. We're killing just as many fish as we're keeping, right? And part of that is because we've subscribed to a myth that if you have a fish and you don't have a lot of information, you just keep increasing the size limit on it. But when you increase the size limit on a fish, you throw back more fish. When you throw back enough fish, you kill more fish than you keep. And that's what happened with striped bass. Somewhere around here, we started saying, well, the stock is such that in order for us to protect it, we have to raise the size limit to 26 inches. And so there weren't a lot of 26-inch fish out there. So as the stock grew, the harvest grew, and people started catching more fish. But they also started discarding a lot more fish. And so that's just as bad as catching them, right? Fish doesn't care if it dies from a hook or if it dies after you hook it, it swims back to the bottom. or if an osprey flies away with it, or if it dies in a gill net, it's dead and it's removed from the fishery. And so that's really what we wanted to look at. So that's a challenge. We've tried to reduce bycatch mortality in a shrimp trawl. Shrimp trawls have always had an issue with a lot of bycatch, right? So you go out to trawl for shrimp, but then you catch all the little fish that are there, right? And so that's an issue. We don't want to catch all the juvenile fish. So we have come up with all sorts of innovative ways to try to reduce that bycatch. These are called Florida fish eyes. And in North Carolina, you got to have two of them. They got to be woven into your net. And they allow fish, they're a little hole in the net, and they allow the fish a place when the fish comes in, they can swim out. Not all of them do, but some of them do, right? These are square mesh panels. This is a spooker cone, right? So when the fish gets near here, it kind of sees this dark shape and it goes, and it runs out, okay? And it shoots out the net like that, where shrimp apparently are fearless and have no problem with that, because if you're a shrimp, I mean, you can't be afraid because like you're a shrimp. And so this thing back here is a turtle excluder, right? So that also, if a turtle gets in here, he hits this and then he shoots, depending on how it's configured, either under the net or over the net. And so that's required in all of our trawls. So we've done a job where we're getting results of up to 40% bycatch reduction using some of these technologies. And that's great, right? Is it the panacea we need? Well, if I make 200 tows, I may just catch that next fish in the next tow or the next tow. And maybe he gets out that time and that time and that time, but I still may recoup some of that. I still, if I'm reducing bycatch by 40%, I still have 60% left, right? And that's an issue. And it's expensive. When we finally make a decision, we'll be having a lot of gear that shrimpers are going to be required to put on to reduce bycatch in June of this year. We'll be putting a proclamation on that out. It's expensive. You know, it's very expensive for them to put all that on the net, you know, just to say, oh, 2 years later, well, no, now we want you to do something else. So bycatch is an issue, and it's a changing issue. As water temperatures rise, public health risks increase as well. One little nasty critter, which you might or might not have heard of, is a naturally occurring bacteria, doesn't have anything to do with pollution, called Vibrio. There are about 85 species of Vibrio. The one you're most familiar with is one that is associated with pollution, and it's called Vibrio cholera. Okay? The one we're concerned with is a Vibrio called Vibrio vulnificus. And it is just a single cell, little flagellated bacteria, but it likes warm water. And in warm water, if you're a person with a compromised immune system, it can cause issues, particularly if you consume raw shellfish or if you have a wound exposed to water with that Vibrio in it. When it's septic, when it turns septicemic, it's fatal 50% of the time. It's one of the most dangerous bacteria we have. Most of the staff that I work with, I give public health presentations as well, and I just scare the crap out of them. But, so I'm not here to do that, but I'm saying as water temperatures increase, the FDA and the CDC expect these numbers to rise, and the data certainly looks like that's happening, that we're seeing an increased number of Vibrio cases. Now, we are also seeing an increased number of raw oyster consumption because of the popularity of raw oysters and everything. It's really it's an immune compromise issue. pH. The West Coast is having a problem with this now, where they've had slight increases in acidity of pH due to climate change, due to the carbon dioxide in the water, and it's causing issues with oysters. They can't put shell down, right? They can grow fine once they've settled, but an oyster is a free-swimming larvae, and then it settles out, has a little foot crawls around, cements itself to something like, another oyster, piece of a toilet seat, whatever, and then it grows into an oyster. Well, those pHs, they're having a hard time setting. They're having a hard time putting that cement down in the first place. And so that's an issue. We're seeing salinity increases. I talked about just this much water coming in your inlet affecting salinity. Down here, most of your oysters grow intertidally, right? So they're exposed to the air part of the day because you have a big tide. That exposure to air kills things like boring sponge. And boring sponge is this little yellow thing, and that's on top of a clamshell. And they bore into calcareous substances, and over time they can weaken that animal to a point where it just succumbs to that, and it's either broken apart or it dies. It certainly makes it unsightly, and it's a natural animal, but it likes salinity. It likes high salinity. Most oyster parasites are high salinity animals. Well, where I live, most of our oysters are subtidal. They never see the light of day. And in a subtidal area, if you increase the salinity a certain amount, this boring sponge will get all over those oyster rocks, and it'll outcompete the oysters, and eventually it'll kill off the rock. Hurricanes, like Florence, that put 100 inches of water down in a year, or however much water we had, some ungodly amount, are great for this stuff because they reset the environment, and it flushes this stuff out and it kills it. But as we start to see these salinity increases, we expect to see more of these types of things in our subtidal oyster rocks. So water temperature, more frequent storms, more severe storms, big impacts to that, right? So Florence, we've had a lot of significant mortality in the oyster rocks in North Carolina. It'll be many years before we recover from that. A lot of that's just due to rain, due to heavy rainfall. That was a prodigious amount of rain we had. Like I said, I live in Newport. I had 26 inches of rain in 3 days. And I think some of y'all got more than that down here. Just crazy amounts of rain. It also, the storms impact where the fish are, right? And that impacts the fishermen. If I'm a fisherman in New Bern and I'm a crabber, right? And that's what I do, I go out and set crabs. And a hurricane like that comes through, I'm not grabbing that fall because those crabs are gone. They're running from that fresh water. And they have probably run all the way to the Outer Banks, and they're pushing on the edges of the inlets. We had record catches of, or have been having record catches of shrimp in the ocean in the past several years. In 3 out of the past 4 years, we've had record catches of white shrimp in the ocean. In December and in January off the Outer Banks. That's crazy, right? And some of these shrimp are probably pushed out of our sound. Some of them are coming out of Chesapeake Bay. Not well known for its white shrimp production, right? South Carolina is seeing shrimp down there move. So big issues there as well. I want to talk about science, right? Changes in perception, changes in trust. I can Google anything. I mean, it's true? No. But a lot of people can go online and find out whatever they want to think. And that's what we deal with now, more so than ever. And that's a big change for us. Neil deGrasse Tyson, who probably a lot of you have heard of, calls it a crisis of confidence. There is a crisis of confidence in the public's acceptance and trust of science. And fisheries is an inexact science to start with because you never have all the information that you need. But there is a fallacy out there that's called the correlation equals causation fallacy. And we see more and more of that every day. And we battle that. And we spend a lot of our time correcting misinformation instead of providing information. And that's not productive. Confirmation bias is an issue. If I believe this group is hurting a fishery more than this group is hurting a fishery. I subscribe to news or to a website that tells me what I want to hear. I confirm my bias, right? That happens a lot as well. It happens in the news media. It happens not just in fisheries, it's everywhere. There is a recreational versus commercial component in North Carolina, which is grown greater than it needs to be. We all want sustainable fish, both sides want sustainable fish, yet there tends to be a lot of fighting over this. It's a fight over value. It's more valuable if I catch the fish than if you catch the fish. It's a fight over tradition. I've always done this, therefore I should have the right to do it forever. And so we battle there. I tell people I don't have the luxury to advocate for one side or the other. I'm accused often of siding with the commercial fishermen. My job is to provide sustainable resource for commercial fishermen and for recreational fishermen. And so that's what I do, and I have laws that guide me in that process. Policy and politics. When I first took this job, I met with several legislators. They said, you know, the only thing you got to do is just let the science drive the process, keep the politics out of it. Easy. I'm like, well, that's easy, thanks. That's good advice. Here's my management recommendation based on the science. That's not going to do. Politics enters back into the equation. So, you know, that's part of it. That's part of fisheries management. You use science to a point, then it has a policy aspect, then it has a political aspect. Because we're dealing with people, we're dealing with businesses, we're dealing with environment, all different user groups, right? And we're dealing with a lot of perception versus fact. And so the question is, does the public trust our science? And I have some suggestions on that on my last slide, and I've talked with several staff here today about that. But management challenges in rebuilding. There's a lot of paradoxes and dilemmas that come up in this. And we're really starting to see this now more so because we're having good success rebuilding fisheries. We're finally getting a handle on some of the depleted and overfished stocks, and we're putting tools into place to look at rebuilding those fisheries. So when you manage a fishery, a draconian measure might be a moratorium or stricter measure for harvest. So you can't catch anything. But it can't keep you off the water, right? You're still out there. You're still fishing for something. So the impacts may be tourism. Maybe that was my whole business model was for this person to go catch that fish. And now I'm out of a job, right? I'm going to go call my politician. It can impact associated businesses, fuel, gas, things like that. Can be politically divisive. We know that. That happens pretty much on a daily basis. It may not work. The fisheries science is taking the best information you have available, making management decisions, because you used to tell people, it's like counting trees in a forest, except they're underwater and you can't see them, right? So, other than that, it's easy, right? But our job is to take incomplete information, make management decisions which have immediate impact, usually negative, on somebody, and may not have a positive impact for several years while we wait to a stock to rebuild or whatever. And if we got something wrong in the first part, it may not work at all, right? So we've shut down fisheries and they didn't come back. And maybe it's habitat, maybe it's spawning relationships, something like that. But that's always in the back of your mind if you're in fisheries management. Is all these things that I have to do by law to protect the species, and maybe they don't work. Maybe it's that discard mortality. Maybe it's this gear was more efficient than we thought it maybe it's habitat, environment. I'll give you a couple examples. This is blueback herring, one of our river herring, right? So if you look, this is Michelle's ball graph. It's very scientific. I don't know where she went to school. She just left as she was one of our council people, but she was very smart. This is recruitment. This is the number of fish that are entering into the fishery that are old enough to spawn, right? That's recruitment, we call that. This is our spawning stock biomass. That's the weight, in this case in pounds, of the mature fish, right? So this blue curve is what we predict will happen with recruitment, with how many recruits we get as our spawning stock biomass increases, right? That's what the math tells us. We plug all the information in, that's what the math tells us. The little green dots with the numbers are years, okay? So what looks different about this graph? They're all below the blue line, right? This fishery, they're not recruiting to the fishery. We got pretty good agreement in the first 10, 15 years right here because statistics does a better job on a short time frame than it does as you push it out. But here, all these they're under recruiting. Well, we're increasing our biomass. Why isn't that recruiting? Well, because recruitment to a fishery doesn't necessarily increase when you increase spawning stock biomass. It's not a linear, it's not a correlation in a lot of fisheries. A lot of times, that year class right there, where we had a ton of recruits, carries this fishery until the next big recruitment year. And it might have nothing to do with how much we harvest. It might have to do with how much spawning habitat is available. A lot of different factors. The environment. So, you know, that's a challenge for us, right? And it's an unknown that we have to look at. Here's another example. I call it, because I'm not a scientist, I call it the recovering stock dilemma, okay? So here's three fisheries, commercial and recreational. This is weakfish, red snapper, Atlantic striped bass. All of these fisheries have had, at one point in time, severe curtailments to harvest to increase the spawning stock biomass, that weight of the fishery that we want to see to go up so we get more recruits, right? So the first thing we do is we reduce harvest. Maybe we say you can only catch one, or maybe we say you can't catch any, right? Red snapper is a good example of that. Well, as that spawning stock increases, maybe we do have some good recruitment years, right? And then we have a lot more fish, but we still don't want to fish them because we're waiting for these fish to make it, you know, higher up. We want more recruits, particularly with a longer-lived species. We want lots of fish in every year class. So if a fish lives 20 years, we want lots of fish in all those, right? And we should stay within our statutory roles. I have very specific guidelines in the North Carolina statutes that I live in, and I need to stay in my lane, right? And that's important. And it hasn't always happened in my division. And we need to look at all of the user groups. The recreational, the commercial, the environmentalists, developers, all of those are user groups when we come to our resource. And with that, I hope I've given you somewhat of a glimpse at what we do, and I will take any questions you have. Thank you.